Greetings and welcome back to part two of theories related to terrorism. Let me go ahead and get right into discussing the personality of the perpetrator. And here I rely on the excellent work of Kressel and his book Mass Hate, The Global Rise of Genocide and Terror, published by Westview Press back in 2002. I think Kressel really does a nice job of taking more of a social psychological perspective. So kind of we're in between now from the social structural societal ones and the individualistic models. So the authoritarian personality, here we start thinking about how this relates to a lot of times those who would follow a particular leader and also leaders as well. But the authoritarian personality is reported to be a cluster of characteristics where the person likes to dominate over subordinates but defers to superiors and dislikes ambiguity or science, has a major concern about other people's sexuality. And often what we have here is another model that has a baseline in the psychoanalytic perspective. And so we see that situation where you see that person having a particular connection to that authoritarian personality with leaders and the followers. Also discussed are factors such as frustration and aggression. There's a theory discussed in, I believe, in the Who Becomes Terrorists and Why book that I'll link for you. And also we see that one of the problems we have is how do we account, one of the problems was that with authoritarian personality, a lot of the research focused on far right, basically, and what about authoritarianism on far left? And so we have to really look at that aspect and focus on authoritarianism on various groups, whether they are far right, which has been the traditional emphasis and focus, or far left. I should say extremist right or extremist left. I think you know what I'm talking about here in regards to that. It's an interesting model by Dr. Beck, who really looks at cognitive psychology, and he focuses more in his book on prisoners of hate. The cognitive basis of anger, hostility, and violence is thinking patterns, thought patterns, and belief systems, and how they're constructed, and how you have the creation of enemies, of monsters, of those that have to be stopped, and the development of irrational thinking and delusional thinking, and the development of anxiety and paranoia and hate, all kind of coming together where you would have people then engage in terroristic behavior or genocidal behavior. And then we have social learning and differential association theory. So probably everyone's familiar with social learning theory, often discussed in a variety of disciplines, where people basically learn from others. They learn the methods, motivations, and rationalizations of their behavior. And a lot of this, and the social learning differential association theory, coming from Sutherland and Cressy's book on criminology, is very helpful as well, looking at how, and you can apply this to all kinds of behavior related to crime. But if you were to think about terroristic behavior, criminal behaviors learned through interactions with groups, so it'd be groups related to terrorism, and the methods, the motivations, and the rationalizations are learned from others in the terrorist group. And so the same principles basically operate in criminal and non-criminal organizations. So you can apply this to any organization, basically. Of course, we wonder, what about criminal behaviors that were not learned in groups? One of the areas that we'll see later on that we start addressing would be where someone is a lone wolf terrorist, doesn't appear to be related to a group, but then we'll take a look at whether they had virtual or online socialization in that regard. Intergenerational transmission theory looks at learning from family and community members and how ideas are kind of passed on. So, and perpetuates perpetration or victimization and ideas related to that. So I'm not going to really mention too much on that. It's a very popular perspective in the child abuse neglect field. Exchange theory looks at the rewards and the costs. What do the terrorists have to gain? What do they have to lose? And so even though this is a rather narrow theory, we can begin to look at how they conduct their own psychological or sociological calculus on the cost versus the benefits. And then we also have, moving back to Kressel's work, where he talks about Milgram's obedience to authority study, and how followers often become very obedient and follow the orders and the patterns of their leaders. And of course, the study relates there to the delivery of what the person thought they were doing, shocking others. And basically Milgram convinced a bunch of people who seem normal to shock people participating in an experiment, and some even at high levels, thinking they were shocking someone, even though of course they really weren't. They were shocking an actor basically. And so we see some of those dynamics, the power of the situation, and how that relates to terrorism. Of course, there's a lot of criticism related to that experimental type setting. And then one of the classics is Zimbardo's mock prison study, which you had, the similar situation where you had the prison guards become abusive and antagonistic toward the prisoners. In this mock prison study where they basically brought in relatively normal people, they say, to divide them up, to some to be prisoners, some to be guards, and had to stop the study pretty quick because the guards became abusive toward the prisoners. Okay, moving on, and I already mentioned that my theoretical bias is geared towards symbolic interactionism, and here we focus on social interaction, self-development, role-taking, and the meaning of symbols, and how behaviors and ideas are labeled. And one of the well-known authors and developers of symbolic interaction is Herbert Blumer, and his well-known book in 1969 on symbolic interactionism. He talks about that symbolic interactionism is based on the premise that people act based on meanings which derive from interactions with others and are interpreted by the individual. So this really gets into that whole idea of looking at how people interact and make sense of their situations in their lives, and use others kind of to reflect back whether the community is there that they're living in, or they have some community they're referring to in a virtual world. So I think symbolic interactionism offers a wealth of information to understanding individual terrorists and terrorist organizations and groups and reactions to terrorists. One of the criticisms, and some would argue this really is not valid, but is that symbolic interactionism ignores social structure and power and may not explain the original motivation to engage in terroristic behaviors. Later on in the semester, I'm going to focus some attention on violentization theory developed by Lonnie Athens, but I'm not going to go over any of that here because I'm going to spend a lot more time later talking about applying that theory to terrorism. The ecological models are out there, very helpful. Feminist conflict approach, also very helpful. Looking at power relationships, analyzing male dominance in societies, and inequalities in power between groups. So a critical conflict feminist perspective is often very helpful to examine power relationships. And then we have strain theory, and here we're moving into structural models, really looking at society, more macro level models, I should say. Strain theory looks at conditions of normlessness, confusion, and ambiguity, and here we have the work of Robert Merton and his anomie theory, and looking at his different ideas. And then I have a summary of Linsky, Bachman, and Strauss's study, Stress, Culture, and Aggression, published in 1995 by Yale University Press, looking at a variety of measures in the at the state level, and then looking at crime rates, and looking at, for example, the more stress in the social environment, the higher the violent crime rates. And they look at other specific crimes and specific stressors related to economic, family, and community stress. They have 15 factors. So again, here we're moving into even a more macro level direction. And other studies are out there that are relevant. A while back, I looked at David Levinson's 1989 study using the Human Relations Area File to look at a sample of 90 pre-literate and peasant societies, and he found that violence was absent or rare in 15 of those 90 societies. So that, to me, is just extremely fascinating, that there are actually societies that are not violent. So it's a possibility. And then we go back and we say, well, what's going on there? How do you differentiate violent from non-violent societies? It gets into a whole nother area that's out there, a huge area of looking at levels of violence at the societal level. Techniques of neutralization, Sykes and Motts talk about that. Early on in their 1957 Techniques of Neutralization, a Theory of Delinquency from the American Sociological Review. And one of the things that we use that for is how terrorists neutralize what they did. They deny responsibility, deny injury, deny the victim, and condemn the condemners, and appeal to higher loyalties, for example. So how they justify is often important to understand how they make sense of this. Getting more in the anthropological and philosophical, for example, Ernest Becker's work on escape from evil, looking at scapegoating to discharge the human or evil side, and reaffirm a power for one's group's survival in life, and how scapegoating brings groups together, and how a group may create evil to then destroy it. And this is all related to the human fear of death. So this may have some really important implications when we look at, for example, suicide terrorism. And there are other structural theories as well, and I have a couple more on the PowerPoint, but then I think it's important to look at Harf and Gur's work on risk factors for ethno-political rebellion. And again, they start looking at cultural social factors, more large-scale macro, like loss of autonomy, cultural identity issues, economic, political, and cultural discrimination, changes in regime structure, things of that nature. And so they use that, some of those factors as warnings and things that may accelerate terrorist group formation and acts and so on. And then I added routine activities theory toward the end of the PowerPoint. There's three main elements, and Felston in Crime in Everyday Life discusses this, that three main elements for a criminal act: a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a guardian to prevent the crime from occurring. And I think what we'll see is the routine activities theory, while not really explaining terrorist formation, or the organization, the roots of terrorism, what we have here is something that can be applied for counterterrorism and protecting fortifying societies to prevent a terroristic attack from occurring in the first place. So there's just a few ideas related to some of the theories as a brief overview. And I'll have some materials posted that get into more depth and detail on a few of these. But as far as in working in the course, it's open-ended as far as what theory or theories you like to use. I'm certainly not going to say you should use this one or that one. You know, the big problem is deciding really, I think, what theory or theories you will find very useful to answering and your questions and conducting your research. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.